from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
President Trump clears more weapons for Ukraine, but the U.S. will not pay for them. Welcome to the Monday edition of Balance of Power. As President Trump makes the announcement alongside the Secretary General of NATO today, while also delaying possible sanctions against Russia for some 50 days. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington, where Ukraine is our top story today. Kailey, the president leaning into this story in a way that we haven't heard him yet.
Well, absolutely, as he continually is expressing frustration with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Not only is the U.S. now sending more weapons to Ukraine via NATO, which will actually distribute them and pay for them, according to President Trump, but ramping up potentially the economic pressure as well. That is, if a deal can't be reached in this 50-day window. If no such deal is reached, that's when 100% secondary tariffs kick in. Specifically secondary tariffs, not secondary sanctions, were the words of the president.
Although it appears the administration might be using those words interchangeably, as we heard from Howard Lutnick in a chance to clarify that. It kind of sounds like the same thing. He might have meant tariff when he said sanctions, and then maybe there's no difference in their eyes. Either way, it's not a 2-week delay this time. It's a 50-day delay. And those weapons that we're sending in some cases will come from our European allies and will backfill their supplies. So there are a couple of layers here and the complexities to this deal. It kind of reminds us of we'll build a wall and have Mexico pay for it.
Well, yeah, that's a very good point. There's also the question of what this does to the congressional effort to enact more sanctions on Russia, that bill being spearheaded by Senator Lindsey Graham that would have 500% secondary tariffs on countries that are helping Russia. President Trump seemed to suggest that 500, 100, there's no real difference. They'll have the same effect.
Hard to tell how that all comes together here, but we're going to explore this coming up with some smart folks, including retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery. I'm looking forward to this conversation, Kailey, not only about the weapons, the equipment, as President Trump likes to call it, used here, but exactly how this arrangement's going to work.
Yeah, so that conversation is coming up in just a few moments, but we begin, as always, with a check on financial markets. And for a look at that, we turn to Charlie Pellet up in New York. Hey, Charlie. And
a good day from New York. Trade, tariffs, sanctions, certainly very much in focus, helping drive today's sentiment. But right now, we're looking at the S&P very close to session highs as President Trump says he is open to trade talks. The S&P right now pushing higher by 6 points, 62.66 where we stand. That is a gain of 0.1%. The Dow also higher by 24 points now, up by 0.1%. NASDAQ up 66, up by about 0.3%. Our Mag 7 index up 0.2%. The 10-year ahead of bank earnings 4.42%. The 2-year 3.89%. Gold lower little change, down 0.2%, 33.48. And West Texas Intermediate crude down 1.7%, 67.29 per barrel of WTI. Bitcoin now higher by 1% at 120,260. Had been closing in on 122,000 earlier in the session, but right now Bitcoin showing a gain of 1%. Sources tell Bloomberg Autodesk is no longer pursuing an acquisition of PTC, which would have ranked as one of this year's largest deals. Shares of Autodesk, they are gaining on that word, up by 5.6%. PTC is lower by 1.7%. Recapping, stocks higher across the board. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all advancing as we continue to monitor any and all tariff or sanction developments. S&P up 7, up 0.1%. Back we go to Washington. Balance of Power continues now. Once again, your hosts, Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
All right, Charlie Pellet, I think the answer is both and. It's both sanctions developments and tariff developments potentially as we consider, obviously, the tariffs that the president is now threatening will take effect August 1st against various trading partners, including 30% for Mexico and Canada, but also the tariffs that the president is now threatening against countries that help Russia. Secondary tariffs is how he was phrasing this as he sat down in the Oval Office earlier today with the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte.
But we're very, very unhappy with them, and we're going to be doing very severe tariffs if we don't have a deal in 50 days. Tariffs at about 100%. I'm disappointed in President Putin because I thought we would have had a deal 2 months ago, but it doesn't seem to get there. So based on that, we're going to be doing secondary tariffs if we don't have a deal in 50 days. It's very simple. And they'll be at 100%. And that's the way it is.
Indeed, when you look at the definitions for tariff and sanction They are sort of different, but they are both, I guess, financial penalties. We can agree on that.
Economic leverage.
Economic leverage. He's pulling economic levers. Let's see if Kate Sullivan knows about this. She actually covers the White House for Bloomberg. Kate, we're just using these interchangeably here. We know, I think, what he's talking about. Kailey brings up a great point. We've got the weapons component here. That's a big deal because it would go beyond the drawdown that the president currently has. It would go beyond the summer. NATO pays for it. And we can certainly talk more about that. We will with the Rear Admiral in terms of what it is that they'll be buying. Right. But when it comes to sanctions, as Kailey asked, what does this mean for the effort that's underway on Capitol Hill? Lindsey Graham's got a bill that the president seemed to like last week. Does he still?
You know, it's really interesting. So one thing we heard Trump just say was, you know, I don't know if we're really going to need that, which I think is really interesting because he's not shooting it down. He's still open to it. But I think you heard him say, you know, if we do it this way with the tariffs or sanctions, you know, I know Lutnick was talking about how he's got these different economic tools in his toolbox. You know, these things in his toolbox, he would not need congressional approval for. So I think we're still waiting to see whether, you know, he's going to go that route, or it seems like he's still trying to keep all the options on the table. But it was interesting that he said, you know, we might not need that when it comes to what's going on Capitol Hill. Well,
and he's essentially said once you get to 500, that incrementally doesn't make a difference. That 100 is still going to have potentially a similar effect in terms of the tariff rate. When we consider the countries that this is likely to affect, Kate, is the end target here China? Is it India, who, of course, is still trying to work separately on trade with the United States? Because he didn't necessarily get specific, but I'm assuming he's talking about purchasers of oil and gas from Russia.
Right. I think so. I mean, we still don't know. And so I wouldn't want to get ahead of that. I think we're still trying to press the White House to find out more details on. But I think that definitely could be part of this. I mean, I think there are a bunch of different angles here. And when it comes to just, you know, putting this pressure on Russia to end the war, because this is something that Trump promised over and over again on the campaign trail was something that he could do in 24 hours. And, you know, I think we've seen the frustration about how Putin has been handling this just really bubbling up over the last few months. And so I think definitely that could be part of this here.
You wonder how this potentially colors any trade deal that could be in the works with India right now, knowing that India would suffer greatly from secondary sanctions if, in fact, they were put in place. You've got an August 1 deadline, though, on India for reciprocal tariffs. I suppose that could move again. 50 days for Russia, so maybe they don't bump into each other. Is that something the White House is cognizant of?
You know, I mean, the short answer is I'm not sure. I think, you know, we're still trying to see how this is all going to play out and how this is going to affect. I mean, there's so many different deals that they're working on. As you mentioned, there are things that, you know, are threatened and then pulled back. They're moving deadlines. And so I think there's a lot up in the air right now. But what we did hear today from Trump, I think, was just a very, you know, clear message when it comes to increasing frustration with Vladimir Putin. A huge reversal. I mean, this weapons package to the deal, I mean, I think was just, it's so stunning to think that, you know, even just a few months ago to think that the U.S. would be providing more weapons to Ukraine, although, of course, that's not how they're framing it. It's that NATO is going to buy the weapons. And then so I think the framing of it as a business deal is really important here because, you know, his base doesn't want to be sending weapons to Ukraine. And this is something that he talked about on the campaign trail so much. And to have it kind of structured as, you know, this is a business deal. We're going to make money off of this. And then this is really kind of NATO's problem now is just, I thought was really interesting and gave him a lot of political cover.
Yeah, I mean, he was very clear that the U.S. is not paying for these, that they are being paid for. Does that signal that as much as he may be growing increasingly frustrated with Vladimir Putin and with the fact that this war is still ongoing, that he does not yet find himself ready to be pushing Congress, say, for more actual assistance to Ukraine to be passed?
That's right. And I think, you know, up until now, all of the weapons and assistance that was being sent to Ukraine had been, you know, authorized under the Biden administration. And so there were no new weapons packages that Trump had approved that were going over there. So this is extremely significant because I think, you know, even though, you know, he's not ready to really own this. And I think the language that he was using today, you know, he was saying this is Biden's war. This is the Democrats' war. This is not a Trump war is very important because I think he's very aware of the perception that if the U.S. starts sending weapons directly to Ukraine, that he's, you know, gonna be hurt by that politically. He doesn't want to do that. He doesn't want to push Congress to do that. But this is, a thing that, we heard him talk about this last week, and it's been happening over the past few days with this rollout of this announcement. But it's just a really interesting and very Trump way to kind of handle this foreign policy, and I think is really colored by his also personal relationships with foreign leaders, with Rutte and with Vladimir Putin. His personal feelings when it comes to these people, I think, is playing a big role here too.
Never forget when he screenshotted the text from Mark Rutte before the NATO summit.
Yes, when
Rutte was praising him. Just posted it right on True Social. Kate Sullivan, who covers the White House for us here at Bloomberg, thank you so much. Shedding some light on the thinking, perhaps, from this administration around the weapons package that was announced today that NATO, of course, will be handling. Here's how the president phrased it in the Oval Office earlier.
It's everything. It's Patriots. It's all of them. It's a full complement with the batteries.
And when do you expect them to arrive in Ukraine, sir?
Well, we're going to have some come very soon, within days, actually. Because a couple of the countries that have Patriots are going to swap over and will replace the Patriots with the ones they have. And Matt will coordinate with NATO. But so it's going to be, they're going to start arriving very soon.
And we want to get more on these weapon systems that are going to be heading Ukraine's way, whatever the route is. Of course, this route through NATO, and turn to retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, who's joining us now here on Bloomberg TV and radio. He's a former destroyer squadron commander, now senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Admiral, thank you for being here on Balance of Power. When we consider these Patriot missile systems themselves, the idea that the U.S. will be backfilling countries that send these systems to Ukraine, how quickly can we actually do so? What kind of capacity exists in this regard right now?
Well, thanks for having me. This is the real challenge. That the president's language was a little non-specific, as was Rutte's, and conflicting. But I will tell you, we can get them there quickly through either of the two routes that were mentioned. The one route of the Europeans transfer their PAC-2, that's a lower level type of Patriot missile, to the Ukrainians, what the Ukrainians could use very easily, and then backfill and order them from the United States to refill the European armory, or the United States could transfer them, and then NATO pays, the European countries pay the United States for the United States to replenish itself. Either of those methods gets them there much quicker than a Ukrainian order from the from a defense industrial base country, which would be years. Either of these cases, he says, could be weeks to months to have missiles and batteries transferring to Ukraine.
Admiral, we're really glad to have you with us today, because before you were on the USS Nimitz, the USS McCampbell, the USS Elliott, the USS Bainbridge, and I can keep going, the Teddy Roosevelt, you were on the National Security Council at the White House, late 90s. And when we look back a couple of years here, how do we rationalize the fact that we've been having this conversation about our defense industrial base for decades, and we really don't have a greater capacity to show for it? Was this not something that you were talking about that many years ago inside the White House?
No, you're exactly right. I think we've got about a 20-year deficit, particularly in our munitions, and that's what we're talking about here, whether it's Patriot missiles here, the Standard missiles the Navy was using to shoot down Houthi rebel cruise missiles, or the offensive weapons that we were using against the Houthis or have used in other locales. We were running at about 25% of the proper level of munitions order. In other words, when we needed 4, we ordered 1. And when you do that over 20 years, you really create a deficit. And worse, you tell the defense industrial base companies, I'm not going to do major orders, and they reduce their ability to produce. So what you've seen over the last 3 years are pretty consistent from the supplemental, the Ukraine supplemental, Taiwan supplemental a couple years ago, this year's budget and next year's budget, actual investments in the defense industrial base where the United States is contributing to defense industrial base companies like Lockheed and Raytheon and Northrop Grumman to expand their ability, their capacity to produce. They obviously contribute. And so we are beginning to grow our capacity. But this is a 20-year deficit. The only deficit that's worse is the European one, which almost went to 0.
Well, and now, of course, Europeans are trying to step up in their own defense spending category, which is one of the main aims of this administration. And that was a point emphasized by Secretary General Rutte in the Oval Office with the president earlier. As we consider the kind of allied capacity, if you will, I also would like to ask you, Admiral, about Russia's capacity, and specifically the supply of weapons that Russia is still getting from countries like North Korea. How should we be considering Russia's ability to continue to replenish its own stocks, continue striking Ukraine, often civilian targets, and how it's matched against the assistance Ukraine is now getting in terms of air defenses?
Well, that's a great question, Kelly, because you're exactly right. Ukraine is fighting 4 countries: Russia, North Korea, Iran, and China. And in fact, Russia today is firing more artillery from North Korea than their own. In other words, the majority of the artillery being used by Russia is North Korean. North Korea gave about 6 million rounds, which is 20 years of U.S. production, to the Russians. Iran has built a Shahed drone factory in Russia. After giving them thousands of their own Shahed drones or selling them, they now have a factory there producing it. That's what's hammering the Ukrainian cities every night. And the third thing is China has been backstopping the economy with increases in imports and exports, but equally importantly, providing the microelectronics that are used in Russian cruise and ballistic missiles. So all 3 of these countries, as axis of authoritarians, are supporting the 4th, Russia, in this fight. And that's who Ukraine's been going against. So that's probably why it's appropriate for the United States and Europe to assist with at least with equipment, but not forces.
It's incredible to consider 4 countries. You know, Bloomberg interviewed the head of Ukrainian military intelligence, Admiral, who said North Korea is now supplying as much as 40% of Russia's ammunition in this war. You mentioned the shells that we're having trouble manufacturing as quickly, but they're prepared at least to send a lot of other stuff. Ballistic missiles, artillery systems. Russia, of course, providing money and technology to North Korea in return. What's the weapon system you're most worried about? And could we see them include nukes coming from Pyongyang?
So, well, certainly not nukes, because, not that Russia would use them, but they have their own tactical nukes already. But I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's something we should always be sensitive to. But the North Korean thing, the North Korean weapons that bother me the most are, in fact, the artillery rounds. You're exactly right. But what bothers me even more than those are those Shahed drones. Shahed drones from Iran and the factory that was built in Russia are really putting pressure on the Ukrainian air defense system, and they're causing civilian casualties and damage to critical infrastructure. Energy, water, the financial systems of Ukraine are hit every night. And so, to me, that Iranian drone and that North Korean artillery are really making a difference in hurting the Ukrainians.
Well, and as you point to the targets that Russia is taking aim at in Ukraine, obviously part of the objective here, Admiral, is to wear on Ukrainian morale. Do you sense that we reach a point where that is effective, where Ukraine's kind of desire to keep prosecuting or defending itself in this war is going to diminish? Is Russia being effective in that regard?
So I don't think so. And here's why I say that. I go to Ukraine every quarter for a couple of weeks to do training with their military and their general staff. And I am convinced the Ukrainians won't lose. That doesn't mean they can push Russia out. It doesn't mean they can recapture Crimea, but they won't lose. They're losing incrementally, a kilometer here, a kilometer there of land, but they have the societal resilience to stay in this fight and win. They just need access to weapons, and that's what President Trump gave them today. He gave them access to weapon systems that they need. The one thing I wish he had gone one step further and given them access to some of our offensive weapons again, the ATACMS, long-range artillery. That would have been great, because then they could break up Russian formations when they're coming together in Russia by waiting till they're very close to the Ukrainian lines.
Yeah.
We want to stay in touch with you, Admiral. Let us know when you're going back to Ukraine. Retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, Senior Fellow, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. We thank you for the insights, only here on Bloomberg.
With Bitcoin north of 120,000, just in time for Crypto Week in the House of Representatives. Or maybe it's because it's Crypto Week in the House of Representatives, Joe, is that those lawmakers are gearing up to vote on 3 separate pieces of legislation pertaining to the industry this week. They'll, of course, be voting to pass the Genius Act, which passed the United States Senate earlier, that will regulate stablecoins, specifically looking to pass the Clarity Act, which is a market structure bill, divvy up jurisdiction between the SEC and CFTC, and pass some anti-CBDC legislation as well. Crypto Week.
Yes. Don't you miss when she was hosting the crypto show? This is like the old Kailey coming out. But I have to admit, you're the first person I asked when I walked in today, what the heck is going on? $120,000 is a really big deal. wouldn't it be like us in Washington to really take credit for that? But there could be something to this here. The fact that it's being institutionalized on this level, you see Congressman French Hill doing Sunday morning TV talking about crypto. We're in a different world than we would have been a year ago.
Yeah, well, the whole idea is that especially if you get the regulatory clarity the industry has been pushing for years, that could open up all sorts of doors in terms of institutional appetite for cryptocurrencies if there's a greater clarity on the regulatory front. This is what they've been lobbying for. That's
for sure. You certainly hear a lot about that. We heard a lot of $1 million price targets floating around over the weekend, too. And this is the type of thing that gets that talk started. So let's get our panel together here today. We're going to get into the crypto week and also the rescissions package that's looming on Capitol Hill, whether it ever sees the light of day. We're going to ask Jeanne Zaino about this, Bloomberg Politics contributor and senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Great to have Jeanne with us alongside Brittany Martinez, Republican strategist, founder, executive director, Espina and Company, runs Principles First. And it's great to have you with us as well, Brittany. Jeanne, is this real? Is Washington really deserving of the credit for $120,000 on Bitcoin?
Well, you know, I think what's deserving of the credit is the enormous amount of lobbying that went into this bill. And you were just talking about this with Kailey. I was looking back at the contributions that stablecoin and Bitcoin made in the last election to both sides of the aisle. It was one of the largest groups donating in 2024, and this has been the case for many cycles. And so I think what it reinforces is you give money to representatives and senators, you will get bipartisan support for legislation that you like. And that's what we saw in the Senate. And that's what we suspect we're going to see in the House. I don't know what it says about Washington, D.C., whether they should be trumpeting credit, but they took in a lot of money and they're delivering on those promises.
Well, and we should point out that this also was an objective for President Trump. He wants to see this legislation passing. He wants to be the most pro-crypto president in history. Brittany, when we consider, though, that this is not budget reconciliation, it's going to require Democrats to get this across the finish line, certainly in the Senate. What incentive do Democrats have, even those who might be pro-crypto, to cooperate with Republicans on this legislation, having just gotten steamrolled in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act?
I think you'll probably see pushback from Democrats, honestly. It's always going to happen, but certainly in an administration like this, to Jeanne's point, it's about follow the money. Are you getting donations from this? And it shouldn't affect the way that you legislate, but, you know, we're in D.C. I think we know that it kind of affects the way that you legislate a little bit. And I think that crypto's here to stay. And so if Democrats, I think the one thing that might be able to sort of get them across this finish line is, do you want to help usher in this new age? Do you want to be innovative and part of this? And I think that might be able to sway some hearts and minds.
You wonder if it's important enough for Republicans to entertain this Democratic idea of kind of writing Donald Trump out of the industry, that there would be some sort of curbs put on his involvement. But that's not ever going to happen, is it?
I mean, I think, listen, this is the most Bloomberg-y topic I think I've ever talked about here when it comes to crypto. Yeah. But, you know, Bitcoin and all of those like fancy money terms with this virtual money and currency, we saw what I think are some very clear ethical issues when it comes to the Trump coin and all of those sort of things like that. And I think it would be smart for Republicans to say this is bigger than all of us and, you know, maybe have him take a back seat on this. But no, I mean, this is a Trump show, and so I'm sure he'll be very much out in the front of this.
Yeah, well, we should point out that at the same time, it's crypto week for House Republicans. For Maxine Waters, the ranking member of the House Financial Services Committee, I believe she's calling this anti-crypto corruption week as she pushes this narrative, Jeanne, that this is an ethical problem, that President Trump stands to benefit potentially from this legislation financially. And I wonder if you expect that to be too big of a hurdle for many Democrats to get over, to get to yes on these bills.
You know, I think it is the one thing that is putting pressure the other way on this bill. World, liberty, financial, everything else. By the way, I love Brittany's word, Bloomberg topic. I can't even say it, but it's a great word, great term. You know, the reality is, though, they planned for this. They saw this coming. And that's why, again, look at the money, look at the contributions that went just in 2024. They'll go again in 2026. This has been ratcheting up for a long time across the aisle. And I think in the end, that will keep enough Democrats on board, despite concerns about ethics, which are incredibly real. I think that'll keep enough Democrats on board that this thing will get passed into the president's desk. I think it's an old story in Washington, and it is particularly troubling. I mean, one of the ironies here is for such a new way of doing business and a new introduction into the financial world, something that only, my kids told me about and said you should have invested in 2010 or whenever it started, which I never did. All of a sudden, they have made inroads into the oldest establishment in Congress, and they've done it the old-fashioned way. I mean, it's pretty telling, and it will probably be successful.
Wow, that's pretty good, Jeanne. Well, we talked about a bunch of deadlines earlier in the broadcast. We've got the 1st of August when it comes to reciprocal tariffs. Now, Donald Trump has a 50-day pause or waiting period on Russia sanctions. There's another big one, Kailey, July 18.
Friday.
That's when the rescissions package expires, Friday. So they have the rest of this week to claw back $9.5 billion that we've been talking about. And it's just not as easy as it is said, as it turns out here. Brittany, the idea of clawing back congressionally approved funding, whether it's NPR or USAID, PEPFAR funding, this is very controversial. Forget the $2 trillion that the Doge was going to cut. It looks like this actually might not pass in its current form and will have to be revamped. Is that how it ends?
I think there's a good chance here. I mean, this Congress has been nothing but surprising. So it wouldn't surprise me if it passed. It wouldn't surprise me if it didn't pass.
Yeah.
But what I will say is that, once again, we find the Senate, and especially Republicans in the Senate, pushing back. And they're sort of the ones who are going to be the deciders here. I know that Collins has some concerns. And the broadcast, I think that is going to be a big issue. USAID, I think those are going to be the top things that Republicans are looking at, especially senators who are representing rural areas where broadcasting is important. Right. And we need to make sure that Americans know what's going on. And the last thing I'll say on this is that, I had the privilege to come and share my opinions sometimes and commentate on things, but I'm not a reporter. I'm not a journalist. And when I see Trump saying NPR and PBS and they're worse than the mainstream media, whatever, it just feels like not only is it a hit on freedom of speech, but free press. And so I think that's going to be a big concern for the constitutional Republicans that are in office.
Well, so, Jeanne, knowing that those Republicans who may have those concerns are also being faced with the threat from the president directly to lose his support and endorsement if they don't get behind this, how do you think ultimately they all will come down?
I think it's going to be close. I think we will see, if this has a chance of passing, I do think we're going to see some changes on the public broadcasting because they can only afford to lose 3. And you have a number of rural Republican senators right in the wake, let's not forget, of the devastation in Texas when communication was such an important issue. How can they look at their constituents and justify cutting funds? And it's not a lot of funds, but cutting what little funds go to public broadcasting in those areas, which are for many people in those areas, their only lines of communication. I think USAID, we may see some changes. And then to your and Joe's earlier point, can they do this all and jam the House and get it passed into the president's desk by the 18th? It's going to be short. So I think the president is threatening. They want to get this through. Russ Vought is working as hard as he can. But this one, I think, is going to be close. My guess is we see changes out of the Senate. They try to jam the House. And we'll see if Mike Johnson has the magic touch once again.
No, the parliamentarian might have to have a say in this by the time they're done, which is something we're familiar with at the moment. Brittany, do you buy the conventional wisdom that if Republicans pass the rescissions package, a deal with Democrats on a budget is dead in the water because you've just eliminated whatever trust there was, and there isn't a lot right now?
I don't think there's a lot right now. You're right. I mean, it's Congress. I think that we're always speculating, whose side people are on and if they're going to be able to come across. But when it comes to that, I kind of, but, I'm sorry. I feel like when it comes to this issue right now and what we saw, especially with the One Big Beautiful Bill, there's not a lot of goodwill at the moment. Right. And so I think Democrats are just going to vote party line as much as they can. And I don't think this is any different.
Well, I wonder how the pressure of the government shutting down potentially changes the calculus there. Jeanne, before we let you go, as well, as Brittany just mentioned, the One Big Beautiful Bill, of course, a round of budget reconciliation. Our colleague David Gura caught up with the budget chair in the House, Jody Arrington, in New York earlier today, who suggested he's going to try to do a second budget bill by the end of the year, a follow-up with some new reductions in Medicare, fix any errors from the first one. We know how hard the first one was. Do you really see the odds of a second being able to pass in 2025?
I don't know, Kailey, strap in. We're going to do it all over again. I can't see them being able to do this all over again, but I think these were promises made to people uncomfortable with the bill. So I think they're going to give it a shot. I'm not confident it gets over the line, but we heard the same from Vogt as well about the rescissions, where this is the first of what's going to be many. So I think these are promises. I'm not sure they're going to be able to keep them.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll all find out together. Jeanne, Zaino, and Brittany Martinez, our political panel, as we kick things off the week in Washington on this Monday. Thank you both so much for joining us. And of course, Joe, we've heard the speaker float that as well, that we could get more reconciliation packages. The question is just how hard fought those battles would be.
Ask Joe Biden how easy it is to get two swings at reconciliation in the same Congress. We'll talk more about this, of course, as we make our way through the day. And this idea that the walls are closing in on Jay Powell, it's intensifying what we're hearing from the White House. We'll have more on that next on Bloomberg. As we consider what's happening inside the headquarters of the Federal Reserve, this is not a market mover, at least not yet. But when you drive by the Fed building on Constitution and 20th Street, you see a bunch of orange cones and barrels out there. Kailey, there's a barrier up because they're working on the building. They're rehabbing the building. And this has become the cause du jour at the White House. If you have a problem with Jay Powell, you have a problem with the renovations. This is something we heard about from the likes of Russ Vought and others. And now it's become a full-blown scandal here. I don't know if they want Jay Powell to be using IKEA or what's going to happen, but the idea is Russ Vought referring to it as Versailles, the millions of dollars that are going into the headquarters. They're calling for an audit against the backdrop of continued complaints about Jay Powell and his approach to interest rates. You certainly have heard enough about this from President Trump, who calls him too late Powell. He's called him stupid and other things in front of cameras and microphones. We spent some time with Peter Navarro, the president's trade advisor, who also thinks it's lights out for Jay Powell. Here's what he said.
I think the bond market, frankly, thinks Jerome Powell's a clown at this point because of what he did. And I can go over the three major mistakes he makes, but the bond market will do what the bond market does, seeing the data. And when you see 10-year yields going down significantly like they have been doing, that should tell Jerome Powell that the short-run rates should be coming down significantly. And that's not happening.
It's not happening, and it's not clear if it will happen and what the consequence would be for the Fed chairman himself, as the White House is pushing this cut narrative, but also now apparently creating some concerns as to whether or not the Fed chair actually misled Congress about the cost and the scale of these renovations or rehabilitations, whatever you want to call them. So we wanted to get into this more with Amara Omeokwe, who's joining us in studio here in D.C. She's Bloomberg Federal Reserve reporter. So, Amara, as we know, there's kind of this legal question that we've been grappling with for months as to whether or not the president can actually fire a Fed chair. We know a governor can be removed for cause. Is this whole business with the building potentially a way to drum up cause?
It certainly seems like people in Trump's orbit are trying to lay the groundwork to argue that there is cause to remove Chair Powell from the Board of Governors. The question of whether a president can remove the chair is a little ambiguous, but the question of whether the president can remove a governor on the board is more clear in the law. If there's cause like malfeasance or neglect of duty, then that gives the president more standing. And you hear, you've heard one administration official, Bill Pulte, say that what Chair Powell said to Congress about these renovations when he testified before the Senate last month, that he lied, basically. That's the allegation. And he's saying that would amount to cause. You hear Russ Vought saying that Powell has grossly mismanaged the Fed on social media when he was discussing these renovations. So the use of that language definitely suggests like people in Trump's world are trying to build this case for cause.
His term doesn't even go on for that much longer. I mean, by the time they got the paperwork to fire him, wouldn't he be leaving the building anyway?
His term doesn't go on for that much longer, and Trump has said that he doesn't want to fire Chair Powell. But the context that you all were talking about is very relevant here. This is a president and this is an administration that doesn't like Jerome Powell. They don't like him.
They nominated him in the first place.
Yes, Trump appointed him to chair in the first place, but the relationship now is in a very bad place, right? Powell and fellow policymakers have not delivered the rate cuts that Trump wants this year so far. They don't look like they're going to lower rates at their meeting later this month. Trump is angry. And so you can't separate where we are on this construction project from that anger and this full-scale pressure campaign that the administration has been waging on the Fed to lower rates.
Well, and the Fed is the point here, or more specifically, the FOMC. While Powell obviously has been the person targeted by the administration, while the chair, is only one member of that committee. These decisions are made in a group setting. So even if he does successfully get rid of him, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to change the course of monetary policy.
That is true, but Powell has been he said recently that the Fed would probably be cutting by now, if not for tariffs and the potential for tariffs to drive up inflation. And so Powell has really been the face of this sort of on-hold stance, this face of let's be patient here on rate cuts. And so that's why Trump is so angry. And Powell is known to be someone who does have a lot of influence over the committee, who has been known to kind of be able to move the committee to kind of where he thinks they should be going. And so all of that plays into Trump's ire at Powell because policymakers have not adjusted rates so far this year.
Just to clarify before you leave us, in testimony, Jay Powell refuted what had been reported. He said there are no VIP lounges, there are no water features. There's nothing exotic that's going into the Federal Reserve building. Do we have any idea what they are building in there that's costing so much?
Yeah, the last sort of like big publicly available review of what they are building came out in 2021 from this National Planning Capital Commission. They reviewed the project and signed off on it. And a lot of this seems to be like a disagreement over how you want to label things, right? So like he was asked about rooftop terrace gardens.
Yes.
And the Fed has said, actually, those are like vegetated gardens on the roof, which are good for like sustainability and like they're environmentally friendly. So like a lot of it seems like how angry are you at Powell, and do you want to like sort of cast some of these things that's overly extravagant?
In the eyes of the beholder.
Exactly.
Wow. Fascinating.
Yes,
Amara, thank you so much. Amara Omeokwe, Bloomberg News Federal Reserve reporter. As we try to get to the bottom of this one, maybe we can get a tour, Kailey. I kind of want to see what's going on in there. You mentioned tariffs, though, Kailey, and indeed, Jay Powell has indicated that if it were not for the tariffs that the president has on again, off again, recently adding to over the weekend, that maybe things would be in a different position when it comes to moving rates. And we want to explore this a bit more with Jacob Funk Kirkegaard, non-resident senior fellow with the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Jacob, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. Do you suspect that that is true, that if the tariff policy were at least more predictable or not there to begin with, that Jay Powell would have much more flexibility to start lowering rates now?
Oh, yeah, I would certainly say that the inflationary, the sort of projected path for inflation in the United States would be significantly lower. And that would quite naturally correspond into more freedom for the Fed to cut rates. No doubt about that in my mind. It is possible that, firms front-loaded a lot of stuff ahead of the early April deadline. They may even be eating it initially through their margins, but none of that is sustainable. So I think, I'm on the team that thinks inflation is coming unless.
Well, and I guess we'll get a sense when we get U.S. CPI data tomorrow as to whether or not it is starting to feed through into inflation, knowing that higher tariffs still could be coming just weeks from now, Jacob, as August 1st, of course, is the new deadline we're working with. And the European Union specifically is now being threatened with a 30% tariff on that date. The EU's trade chief, Maros Sefcovic, says that effectively would prohibit trade between the U.S. and EU. Do you view that the same way?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that, even if the 30% do not necessarily include the categories that are already affected by sectorals, that will be autos and steel and aluminum, there'll be a very, very large amount of trade that simply won't be profitable at a 30% tariff. So what this will do is that it will greatly diminish the overall amount of trade that is done. And I think importantly also what that means is that Trump's threat to match any possible EU retaliation to those 30% probably is not very influential for the EU because the initial hit to trade has already been so large. And therefore, it's not a particularly effective deterrent, in the eyes of the EU from its retaliation.
So should we start stockpiling wine and cheese now?
Well, I think yes is the short answer. If you believe that the prospects for a deal are much lower today than they were last week, I am certainly in that category. I think the EU will quite clearly have interpreted the 30%, which is obviously much higher than the initial April 2nd 20%, as kind of a slap in the face, and basically, using the EU's, and I think honest attempt to get a deal as a sign of weakness and as therefore an opportunity to squeeze the EU even more. Once the prospects of some framework of a deal agreed between the EU Trade Commissioner, USTR, and the Department of Commerce reached the White House. So yes, I think the probability, unfortunately, of a no-deal scenario today is higher than last week. And yes, that probably means that you should at least think about stockpiling stuff you'd like from Europe.
Well, it also raises the question of where Europe would turn if trade was effectively cut off in at least large part with the United States. As European officials, Jacob, are now talking about this idea that it will increase engagement with other countries that have been affected by U.S. tariffs. Could the end result of this actually just be a reorientation of the global trading system away from the United States and actually more toward countries like China?
I don't know if more towards China, given that trading with China, certainly from the EU's perspective, today is a very unbalanced, endeavor as well. But no doubt that the EU is very strongly pursuing, deeper trade ties with quote unquote third countries. This weekend, we had the political conclusion of an EU-Indonesia free trade agreement. The EU is also plowing ahead with the potential free trade agreement with India, as well as other members of ASEAN, Thailand, Malaysia, and others. They have obviously recently struck deals with Mercosur in the better part of the South American economy. So absolutely, I think what you are seeing is that countries that still believe in the benefits of free trade, they're going to trade more with each other and less with the United States. Maybe also less with China because of the risk of Chinese overcapacity and sort of excess export growth. But among themselves, absolutely, that's what we will see, which ironically is something that, maybe the Trump administration actually wants at some level by levying so high tariffs on so many U.S. trading partners.
What do you make, Jacob, of the decision to not retaliate? Ursula von der Leyen says there won't be any retaliation ahead of the deadline on August 1st. Is it smart not to escalate?
I think if you're the European Commission, it's a smart move. Because remember, if there is retaliation, this would be by far the largest trade retaliation in European history. The cost of that will be borne by the member states. So if there was any doubt about who wanted that trade escalation, if the Commission could in any sense or shape be accused of being escalatory or hawkish in these negotiations, there'll be a lot of incoming fire headed to the European Commission and Ursula von der Leyen from member state governments. So she's basically insulating herself from doing that by saying, look, we want to make sure that if this comes to a trade war, it's Donald Trump that fires the first shot, not us. So yes, I think it is smart. And obviously from a European point of view, because, Europeans view tariffs as a bad idea. And if you do that, of course, you should use any possible option to avoid it. So absolutely, yes, keep negotiating until, 11:55 p.m. on August 31st.
All right, Jacob, we appreciate you joining us. Jacob Funk Kirkegaard, non-resident senior fellow with the Peterson Institute for International Economics, joining us here on Balance of Power. And we're out of time, Joe. Otherwise, I would have asked Jacob what the difference is between secondary sanctions and secondary tariffs. We're going to have to explore that more, I guess, in the late edition.
Kailey's asking this because they appear to be interchangeable today at the White House, even though they are kind of very different. We'll explore this more, by the way, with Libby Cantrell's going to be on the late edition of Balance of Power. That starts at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll meet you back here with much more from Washington, only on Bloomberg TV and radio.